All right. If anyone would like the opportunity to ask us questions, feel free, or we can just talk about stuff.
This is just specifically to Ben, but I'm curious on how you model the trader utility, because it seems like you guys have a measure for it in your simulations, and then also it's something submitted to the network, right? So in picking who has the largest value for the objective function, solved it best, but how do we know that is actually solving it best for the traders? So what is like trader utility?
Right, so we worked with a lot of different,
Right. We can hear each other.
we have experimented with a lot of different variations of trader utility. One that we've done a lot with has been trader surplus. So this is the limit price that it's the difference between the price that you get and the price that you quoted in your order in the first place. So the clearing price, and so you can make a difference there. And this is considered utility or surplus this is one fairly reasonable measurement that we've been experimenting with that is always non-zero, or always non-negative. And so this is just one. We've experimented with trading volume, of course, although this is certainly not an economic theoretical model. It's much more better to work with these utilities. And surplus is the one we've been using the most.
I'll just speak up. So Yondon, you said in your open questions the provider selection algorithms and the ways to make them like Sybil resistant and using things like stake. Could you talk more about that and the kind of open questions there and how, whether it's stake or other kinds of Sybil resistant algorithms you might use?
Yeah, so what I was getting at with that open question was that I think the easiest thing that you can do for provider selection today is stake-weighted selection. And then you have a Sybil resistance mechanism, which is your staking system. But I wanted to highlight that there might be two separate components you want to think about when you think about provider selection. So the first is, what is your Sybil resistance mechanism? And the second is, what are your performance measurement mechanisms? Because in these service networks, you might not necessarily want to rely on a pure stake-weighted selection process for some of the reasons that I mentioned. And the challenge here and the open research problems are there's different approaches that you can layer on Sybil resistance to traditional performance measurement mechanisms. So the example I provided for a traditional performance measurement mechanism is in the CDN industry, a lot of users construct these technical architectures where you actually use multiple CDNs in order to minimize vendor lock-in, maximize price efficiency, and maximize quality of service. And these technical architectures usually involve measuring performance on a consistent basis and then weighting the CDNs to determine which one you select. So this is in a non-decentralized context. Obviously, in a decentralized context, you have more problems you need to worry about. So this is where layering on Sybil resistance comes in. So the open questions are such that, let's say you are using a staking system and you have certain measurements for things such as latency. How do you combine that into a system that weights both and allows people that are actually high performing to be selected, even if they might not necessarily have it reflect in their stake weight right now?
Just a small addition, taking a step back and thinking why you might want to avoid leaning entirely on stake as your selection input. Beyond just, as Yondon referred to, rewarding those that are providing a high quality service but maybe didn't buy in right at the beginning or didn't have a huge nominal. It also might help with consolidation resistance, because if you're purely focusing on stake and in our network, for example, the large stakeholders can continually restake their subsidies, you end up with perhaps an economies of scale driven consolidation. So there's a possibility that some other vector could help with that. And actually, one other thing that's interesting, another feature of NewCipher that's related to provider selection. As I mentioned, you have something like called team service provision, where you have multiple workers per service or per user. And that leads to some sampling problems too, where if somebody chooses, same with live peer, it's tunable. So someone chooses like a very high security parameter and says, I want 100 workers for this policy. That can sometimes exclude if you base it purely on stake.
I have a question for all of you. It seems pretty well established at this point that we have decent Sybil resistance mechanism designs for actual DOS resistance, but so far there have been, as far as I'm aware, no real tests of collusion resistance, especially incentivized collusion. So I'm curious how well you expect these kinds of systems to hold up in the face of designs like those Phil Diane have suggested for dark DAOs, or basically like incentivized collusive behavior.
I think to answer that question, I guess it's worth thinking about the setting that you're operating in and the type, like the consequences of collusion. So for example, like Phil Diane's work on dark DAOs focuses a lot on the implications of like on-chain voting systems and how collusion can implicate that. So I guess the first thing to identify is what are the consequences of collusion. I do think that there was some interesting work put out recently by Vitalik about like minimal anti-collusion infrastructure that you can set up, although right now it's dependent on a centralized operator in order to make the guarantees around anti-collusion. So I do think that there's some promising work there in order to leverage that for different types of systems. But I think step number one is identifying like what the consequences of the particular collusion are. So thinking about it in the context of live peer, for collusion, I guess one of the worst things that you can do is if there's maximal collusion on the network, you just deny service to a particular user. And that's where I think these switching mechanisms are important, and have it not be pure stake weighted, because the ability to switch is important to allow like rerouting around malicious nodes. So if you do have at least some subset of honest actors on the network, you have the ability to reroute towards them. Whilst if you rely purely on stake-weighted selection, I think collusion can be a little more devastating in that there isn't any ability to reroute around malicious nodes. So,
yeah, very, very similar thoughts. I think a lot of great ideas have obviously percolated up from proof-of-stake networks. One that probably needs to be rethought is this idea of like the percentage of the network or where the security threshold is. So like with NewCipher, it's not 33% or 51%. It's kind of harder to say what it is. If you control all of the nodes, then you, as same with LivePeer, you can block sharing flows, which might have some, might be a worthwhile motive. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Like there isn't a specific percentage. And similarly, you can quite simply reissue sharing policies, even if like 90% of the network was controlled by one adversary. There's still some honest nodes that can provide the service.
All right. So your question got me thinking about which components of our protocol could be susceptible to some form of collusion, and the three spots that I've identified and tried to solve in the moment. One was that the order placement could be a form of collusion. And we've considered this situation where you have the liquidity providers who are, for every single token pair in the protocol, available to say, I'm willing to pay 1% less for this, and I'm willing to sell for 1% more in every token pair direction. And then a market order comes in, which says, I'm willing to pay anything, this for this, and I have this much of this. And so the optimization problem actually exploits this market order that is sort of unbounded in a sense. And so this is actually reasons why we've had to go and, I mean, this isn't really a form of collusion. It's a form of liquidity providers and somebody just coming in and saying, oh, I'm willing to pay whatever the price winds up being. But the optimization problem actually exploits those types of orders. And so market orders need to be sort of redefined in a form of boundedness, or at least given some form of boundedness. Alternatively, there's this problem of minor front running, which is a form of collusion, I suppose. And our sort of attack against that is this sort of sealed bid order collection. So the miner itself, the miner themselves doesn't really know what the orders are anyway, so they can't choose to include or not include them. Of course, collusion amongst solvers is kind of non-existent in the sense that these solvers need to be providing feasible solutions. If they don't, they're losing their stake in the first place. And these feasible solutions are well defined in accordance with the constraints of the system, so people know that they can actually get their prices. And these are just a few places I've identified where some collusion could come up, and trying to whack them all with all of them.
So I've been thinking about this a lot with your design, and the problem of collusion in your model is between the solvers and the miners. Because if I'm a miner who's solving, I can DOS other solvers and just not provide the solution. And then with 5 minutes, you have decent reorg protection, but in Ethereum, 20% of the time you're reorged. That's the acceptable numbers. 1/5 of of the blocks total are reorged in Ethereum. So you take 1/5 of 5 minutes. You work it out. If I'm a miner, I only include my transactions because I know in my own chain, and then I only allow my solvers to solve my feeds. My orders in my chain. And then if I set the spread wide enough, I can afford to DOS the other miners to grind out that attack.
Although in this protocol, you provide the objective, you say, I have a feasible solution with this value beforehand. The contract decides that this message.send or this address is the one who's expected to be providing the solution within some time window.
Yeah, but I filter that as the network attacker, so I decide which bids actually get seen on chain in the first place.
But then you will still be expected to solve the problem and provide something, right?
Yeah, but I'm doing.
But there are other miners out there who are willing to include these
right,
bids.
exactly. So that's exactly
So this
exactly
is a
the
minor
race.
collusion.
Right. So it's the union of the miner and the solver. And so, if you imagine this is actually profitable, who's going to actually run the service? It's going to be miners, right? So, or you're going to have a business deal with the miners and the solvers, right? So that's to me, that's the real threat.
Rick,
Yeah, hi.
I'm curious how happy or unhappy you are with our definitions of rationality and Byzantineness.
I think they're disgusting. I'm sorry, I'm not in the best of moods. But no, I think a lot of the rationality discussions are very frustrating. So to answer your previous question, you have to price it, right? So a lot of times if you look at like a bonding curve, right, and this actually answers your question about rationality. When you look at a bonding curve, if you have your buy and sell spread on your curve, then you can basically say, all right, an attacker can bankrupt my my system, but I'm going to have some money left over to restart the system, right? And I'm sorry, that was probably super terse for people who don't already know what I'm talking about. Let me try that again. So in a bonding curve, you can have a buy price and it's like A times B equals K. But if you say that it's not the same in both directions, so like A times B, like epsilon something, and then B times A, epsilon something else. Now we have two different curves, and now I can sort of protect against someone trying to drain the curve, as opposed to just saying that the price is at infinity, or that last one on your chart, like the second to last one. I can actually just ensure that I get paid when someone tries to attack the system. And so you can apply that same mechanism to all the mechanisms that have been described here, where basically an attacker comes and they are, they literally have 1 million times the resources as the next biggest person, because that's what a whale is in crypto space. Literally, there's someone who has literally 1 million times the resources as potentially the next person. And so that person shows up and they say, okay, I'm going to shut down the system. And you say, okay, great, it costs you $5 million. And they say, awesome, I'm going to pay $5 million, I'm going to shut down your system, everyone's happy. You go take the $5 million, you restart the system, your users have a bit of disruption, but everyone moves on. And that should be, a disincentive to rational actors. But as we've seen in the history of the cryptoeconomic space, there's lots of irrationality, right? I mean, an enormous amount of irrationality from the dollar perspective.
I think I saw another question.
I've thought a lot about coalition proof mechanisms where we don't assume any kind of rationality. So I'd love to talk to like Beer and Recycler and Charlie about this kind of thing. But I had a question for Matt, which was similar to the live peer, because my area is not really the encryption and then the decryption parts. But are you vulnerable to the kinds of things that Live Peer was talking about, where you decrypt and then how do you deal with the worries about exposing these combined?
Right. So the current implementation does not have these sealed bids. Right now, we're working with a proof of concept that just to see if people would be interested in such an exchange mechanism, have something out there. At some point, yes, this is something we're hoping to do more research on, called distributed key generation. But this requires, of course, another party of people who could potentially be colluding. So, of course, we have not had time to do much in there. This is just an idea. We're just looking for implementation, ways to implement encrypted orders in a way that's also, so there is something that's less feasible and more secure, where you can submit your encrypted information, but then you have a whole nother phase where you reveal your information. You physically do it, which is you from a user perspective not super great, because you have to make a transaction, wait, make another transaction, and then the protocol just sort of acts on those which were revealed. This is a secure one, but it's secure but inconvenient. So there's this distributed key generation, but of course could potentially involve collusion. And I can't say that I've spent too much time thinking about collusion in the first place.
I think that's just about all the time we have. All right. Thank you, everyone.